Hey, what's going on, Thumpers and Hyper Homies? I'm very excited to be here today to bring you something a little bit different. Recently, in the mail, I received the Batman 4-film collection fully restored in 4K. Now, this set is available on June 4th individually. You can also buy a box set both in regular edition and steelbook in September. But if you want to get these bad boys early and you want to get them now, just in time for the summer, I recommend getting these. And I'm going to tell you exactly why. So these movies have been completely restored from the ground up from the original film negative. These movies particularly, well, I would say all of them, not one in particular. I would say all of them do an incredible job of retaining the original grain structure. Depending on the actual film stock that was used, the grain may change. Some grain might be heavier in some shots, some grain might be lighter. There is one particular case with Batman Returns where certain shots for visual effects purposes were shot in VistaVision. Now, if you don't know what VistaVision is a format that was utilized primarily in the 50s and 60s. Alfred Hitchcock was a big advocate for the VistaVision format. What that does is it basically allows you to shoot 35 millimeter film negative horizontally. So it's kind of similar to the way IMAX film is shot. If that sounds familiar to you, that is a little bit more reminiscent of still photography. Still photography uses 35 millimeter going through the gate horizontally. So that's why you're going to see some varying grain structures and sizes depending upon which movie it is, what film stock they use. But I would say that, if you're someone who is not necessarily into the film stocks and the film grains and all that sort of stuff and the film formats that was captured in, it's not really a worry for you. I would say that the scans themselves, the quality of the scan is absolutely incredible. I would say that, the newer movies have the best or better looking restoration only because I'm sure that Batman Forever and Batman and Robin were probably the best archived films of the four, with Batman the first one probably not being the best archived movie because it was kind of done in a rush. And I'm going to talk about some things about the sound that have been changed that I think is going to upset some people. I think it's going to be very divisive. They did it because they presented a brand new Dolby Atmos mix for all four of these films. I would say that Batman and Batman Returns have probably the biggest change in the audio, whereas Batman Forever and Batman and Robin seem like they mostly kept everything intact and they did some enhancements here and there. But let's just stick to the picture quality. I would say that of the four, Batman and Robin obviously looks the best. Most likely, like I said before, it's the quote-unquote newest of the four movies, and it probably was the best archived film. But that doesn't mean that Batman and Batman Returns don't look incredible. I would say that of all the presentations I've seen, and I've owned all four of these movies on VHS, on DVD, on Blu-ray, and now on 4K UHD. And I would say that these 4K UHDs are obviously the best presentation of these movies that I've seen. And there's been a lot of discussion whether or not they are the truest representation of what the filmmakers originally intended. I don't know. We don't really know whether or not Tim Burton and Roger Pratt were supervisors on the restoration of Batman, or if Tim Burton was a supervisor on Batman Returns, or if you had Schumacher on the latter two films. I don't know. That hasn't sort of been fully disclosed. But regardless, I think that the studio, Warner Brothers in particular, understands how important these movies are to the Warner Brothers legacy. These had huge impacts on the superhero genre and also on the studio in the 80s and the 90s. So I think they're very aware of the importance of restoring these movies as close to as they can to the original theatrical experience. And I think they look absolutely incredible in 4K, in HDR. They look amazing. All the highlights, all the lows, it all looks great. Something that I think is going to be talked about is how they look on the Blu-ray. Now, the Blu-ray, the 1080p copy of the movie, utilizes the brand new remasters. But I think because these movies were scanned and optimized for high dynamic range, I think the Blu-ray suffers just a little bit. And I have seen remarks, and I've seen it myself. A lot of the highlights seem to be a bit blown out, and a lot of the highlights take on the green or teal colors that are not present in the 4K HDR. Now, on our television here in the studio, we sort of have three modes for HDR. We have a dark, a neutral, and a light. When we put it into the dark mode, you see a little bit more of that blown out HDR look to it. But when we watch it in neutral or high, that's not present. It just looks like a really high dynamic range image where you've got the whitest of the whites and the blackest of the blacks. And I think the same thing goes for the darks in the shadows. all four of these movies, especially Tim Burton's Batman, the very, very first one, it utilizes the shadows an enormous amount, and there's a lot of black in this image. So, for example, I took some screenshots from the 1080p Blu-ray. I brought them into Photoshop. I brought them into Lightroom, and lo and behold, I mean, the blacks are completely just blacked out 100%, and the highlights are completely blown out. This is obvious in some scenes, but I think at the end of the day, if you are buying these films for the 4K restoration, for the HDR look, you're not really going to be concerned with how the Blu-ray looks. Now, if you are buying these as someone who's trying to future-proof their collection and you don't currently own a 4K television or a 4K Blu-ray player, then I think you may be a little frustrated with how the highlights and the darks look in the 1080p presentations. Now, I completely understand why they wouldn't necessarily want to go back and optimize the presentations for two different formats. I think, look, if you're doing a full 4K UHD restoration, you're going to go full 4K HDR. You're not going to necessarily worry as much about the regular Blu-ray. And I know that can be frustrating for a lot of people, and I completely understand that. But I would say that it's not as big of a deal as some people would make it, that some people have made it out to be. I think it's still watchable. I think they still look really good. I think the color is incredibly expanded. I think the sharpness is incredibly expanded. The detail is amazing. And again, I think the movies that take the fullest advantage of this are Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. Here's a screenshot, a side-by-side of what George Clooney looks like in the 2009-2010 Blu-ray edition. And here it is in the 4K version. Now, it's a huge, drastic difference. I mean, anyone who tells you, it's not that big of a deal, like, it is a big deal. I mean, they're huge. And I think these movies really deserve it, and I think they really need it. Now, there's a lot of people who also are like, well, I don't really want to own Batman Forever and Batman and Robin because they're bad. I'm like, yes, I don't disagree with you. I think that Batman and Robin sort of hits the tone and sticks with the tone a lot more than Batman Forever. Batman Forever kind of jumps back and forth between being campy and light, also being dark and serious. But I'm not trying to review these movies. I love all four of these for very unique reasons. But it's so nice to see these movies fully restored in 4K, especially Batman and Batman Returns, being the older two movies. They've cleaned up some matte lines, they've done some new color timing, and in terms of the color timing, I will say that there are a few scenes where there are inconsistencies in the color timing. The biggest one for me that I saw in the first Batman is when Batman and Vicky Vale are driving to the Batcave. The scene tends to go from a warm temperature to a cool temperature within the same sequence. We're cutting from Vicky to Batman to the exteriors of the Batmobile driving through the forest and then back inside of the vehicle. From the first time we see inside of the car, the shots are warm. When we jump to the outside of the car, they have their own color temperature, but then when we jump back into the car, you would think there'd be a consistency of warmth, but it kind of goes and shifts to the cool side. So I would say there are a few inconsistencies in the color timing, but in terms of the rest of the films, I think it's very, very consistent. It's very reminiscent to what I remember how I saw it in the cinemas, especially some of the more vibrant films. They very much pop, and the colors, it's a huge gamut of color, and I think that's great, and I love the fact that they sort of embraced that, and they didn't try to dial that back for the 4K restoration. The quality of the image is absolutely stunning. Some of these movies look like they were shot no more than 10 years ago, and I think that says a lot about film. But moving on to the sound quality, they did do a full new Dolby Atmos mix for all four of these movies. The original 5.1 mix is not available. You cannot get it on these new 4K UHDs. It's not on the Blu-ray either. The Blu-ray also utilizes the brand new Dolby Atmos mix. Obviously, it's remixed for 7.1, 5.1. It still retains the original stereo audio commentary by Tim Burton and Joel Schumacher. So you can still hear the original sound effects for that on those commentary tracks, but the original tracks, the original audio tracks, and I don't mean the theatrical, I mean the 5.1 remixes that were done for the Blu-ray release or later releases are not available. There's obviously also some other language options. I got excited because I love when Blu-rays and 4K Blu-rays really embrace as many multi-language tracks as they can. I think that's really, really cool. I really do think that this Dolby Atmos track will be divisive. I think some people will love it. The whole point of the Dolby Atmos track was to go in and enhance the sound for the home theater experience. Now, there's a lot of people out there now who are really embracing Dolby Atmos and sort of the 360 world sound that it creates for your home. They can move the sounds around between so many different places while also enhancing the sounds that were already present on the original soundtrack. That does not mean in my opinion, that they completely destroyed what was there. If anything, it enhances it. The score by Danny Elfman and the scores by Elliot Goldenthal are incredibly enhanced with these new restorations. A lot of the original sound effects are also enhanced. A lot of the dialogue is as well enhanced by this brand new Dolby Atmos restoration. You know, a lot of times, a lot of the complaints that I hear from people is, well, when you watch these, a lot of times the dialogue is very low and the sound effects are really big and bombastic. I don't think that's as big of an issue here. I think it's still a little bit of an issue, but I think depending on how your setup is made, I think that you can really enjoy this movie from every angle in terms of the sound. Now, I think where it's going to become controversial for people is the sound effects that were changed. For Batman in '89 in particular, as far as I know, that movie was very much rushed through the post-production process. So they ended up using a lot of sound effects from movies like Aliens and Dirty Harry and a few other ones, particularly the gunfire. The gunfire is something that has definitely been changed and updated. All the guns. Along with that, a lot of the sound effects for the Batmobile were changed. I wish that we were at a point where when we do these restorations, we're okay. I wish the studio was okay with also making the original theatrical soundtrack available for home audiences. Now, it's not the most optimized. It's not maybe necessarily what the director wanted, but that's the original theatrical release. And I think it's okay to embrace that. That's why I like things like the Criterion Collection. Criterion tends to restore the original visual and audio tracks to the way they were theatrically, or to the way that they were finished. Now, that's one thing that I do wish. I do wish that we could have gone back, or the studio would have gone back and restored those things, or at least given us the new 5.1 mix. If the 5.1 mix is taking the original sound that we heard theatrically in 89, 92, 95, and 97 and widening it out to 5.1 channels, I'm okay with that. But to completely go in and change the sound effects and to not make the older version available is a little frustrating, and I see why people would be upset about that, and why I think the audio is going to be way more divisive than the visual elements of this movie. Now, I would say as we go on from Batman Returns to Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, the changes are not as large, and I think that's probably because the budgets were bigger, they had more time, except for maybe Batman and Robin. That was a really rushed movie. But I think they sort of got everything out of it that they wanted. But I think everyone will mostly agree that the look of the movies are absolutely fantastic. This is probably, if you've never seen these films before and you're someone of the younger generation, you've never watched these and you've always been curious, or you just haven't watched these movies in years and you're curious to watch these again, I absolutely recommend picking these up. I think they're an incredibly good get. If you want to wait for the box set, you're welcome to do that. But if you are just frothing at the mouth to watch these movies now, I definitely recommend grabbing these. If you would like to grab this set, or if you want to pre-order the box set, you can do so with our link down in the description below. I can't recommend these enough. I cannot wait to rewatch these again. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this review of the Batman 4K UHD 4-film collection. These are movies that I've loved ever since I was a child, and seeing these in this Ultra HD format was so satisfying, and it really makes you appreciate these movies. And I know they're not all perfect, no movie is, but they are very much a product of their time, and that's why I love them. They're a beautiful capsule and a representation of where we were at that time in the late 80s into the 90s, and sort of what Batman represented and what Batman was. Let me know down in the comments below what you think about these movies. If you bought these 4K remasters, let me know what you thought about it. Are you as upset about the sound as many other people are, or what do you think of the overall picture quality? Are you happy with where it's at? Do you think they could have done things differently? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure you guys subscribe right here, youtube.com/hyperrpg. Follow me on social media, just at Adam Havoc, and I'll catch you in the next video.